Hello, everyone. Emily here, Die for Ag. We have our agroecology expert with us this evening, Dr. Gail Angolato, and she is going to tell us a little bit more about the app and then dig a little deeper into some of the pins, and then hopefully talk a little bit about how this might relate to your life. So if you're trying to figure out what app to do and how to intersect it with your life, this might be a really good webinar to watch. And with that, I will hand it over to you, Dr. Langolato, and take it away.
Thank you, Emily. My pleasure to be here, Dive for Ag. You might notice a couple of photos of insects on the left-hand side of the slide. Top left is a ladybug and bottom left is a moth. And I am confident that I can help you see the way that agroecology intersects with your life, because insects play a big role in agroecology and insects are everywhere. And even if you're not an insect person right now, I'm hoping that by the end of this presentation, you might have a little more knowledge and appreciation for the positive things that insects bring into our life through an agroecological lens. So as Emily mentioned, you have the Agroecology app under consideration as one of the many experiences that you can explore a little bit further to understand how agriculture intersects with your life. And I just want to go over some of the things about the agroecology virtual app that might be a little bit different than other types of agriculture that folks are familiar with. Agroecology really takes into consideration that the world is diverse. Ecosystems are diverse, composed of many different plants and insects and other animals, and that the interactions between all of those different players in an agroecological system helps to create more diversity, which lends greater stability to the system. And agroecology tends to focus more on diversity, and because of that, is oftentimes amenable to smaller agricultural spaces, such as you would find in a more urban or suburban habitat type, versus conventional monocultural-based systems, because of the space that's required, tend to be more common in more rural areas. So wherever you're living, if you have a garden, if you have a small community garden in your space, then that is an example of agroecology in your life. And as I mentioned, one of the key concepts of an agroecological system is that by having more biodiversity in the system, you help to create more resilient systems, healthier ecological systems that bring a lot of benefits to the world around us and surrounding components of those ecosystems. I mentioned at the top of this talk that I am an entomologist, or maybe I didn't mention that, but I did call out those couple of insects. I really love studying entomology because by studying entomology, or the study of insects, you really by default are studying biodiversity. And that's because by most accounts, insects represent more than 50% of the life forms on Earth. To date, scientists have named and described almost 2 million species across the globe. And of those nearly 2 million species, about 56% of them are a type of insect. So if we're considering a biodiversity point of view, insects are integrally important to biodiversity. I always like to pause and share some of the science behind how those numbers are determined. How do we know that more than 50% of insects, more than 50% of life on Earth is a type of insect? Well, here's one example of how that estimation came to be. On the right-hand side of the slide, we have Dr. Terry Irwin of the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., in front of several drawers of the beetles that he studies. Beetles, if most type of life on Earth is a type of insect, most insects are a type of beetle. Beetles are the most biodiverse group within the insects themselves. And when scientists are trying to estimate not only how much life is there on Earth, but how many insects are there on Earth, the estimates range from 2 million to 12 million species of insect. That's a very large range. Let me show you how Terry Irwin came up with his estimate of the number of insect species on Earth. He is absolutely on the higher range. He's on the higher range of the estimates of insect species because he studies beetles, one of the most biodiverse groups of organisms on Earth, and he studied them in the Costa Rican rainforest, which is arguably one of the most biodiverse habitats on Earth. On the right-hand side right here, you see that there are some plastic tarps that are draped beneath some trees. This is Terry Irwin standing right here, and he is holding a fogger that is emitting a broad spectrum insecticide into the canopy of these Costa Rican rainforest trees. As he was fogging the trees with the insecticide, the insects would fall out into the tarps below, and Dr. Irwin and his team would carefully collect and catalog all of the insects that they collected. And that is how he came up with the super high estimate, way beyond what anyone else had come up with, that there must be close to 30 million species of insect on Earth. When he published this paper, putting forth this estimate, several folks were like, you know, Terry Irwin, you need to simmer down. Not everyone works in Costa Rica. Some people work in less diverse temperate forest systems. Not everyone studies beetles. Some people study less diverse bugs. So I'd say that today, most scientists think that the number of insect species on Earth is probably going to fall out somewhere around 8 million species. Still an impressive number. Well, if you are not a person who cares very much for insects, I'm hoping to share some of the services that they bring to our life that might help you appreciate them a little bit more. Insects are critically important to the foods that we like to eat. And they are economically important players in agricultural systems that require insect pollination in order to set fruit. These include things like cucumbers and watermelons and almonds and even cocoa if you love chocolate. Coffee as well as are dependent on insect pollination, such that together, the value of the services that insect pollinators bring to us by virtue of them helping us to grow and harvest healthy crops is in the hundreds of billions of dollars. Beyond insect pollination, I want to share some of the other things insects do, which you may not have thought about. And if you have thought about this, then I want to talk to you because you probably aren't entomologists. There would be no other reason to think about this. Insects help to process organic waste. And what you see on this photo, on this slide, on the right-hand side are what are known as dung beetles. And dung beetles are actually attracted to the poop of vertebrates. And what they do in pasture systems where there are cattle or there are horses or there are other types of livestock is that the livestock will defecate, and that attracts a bunch of dung beetles to the pile that will work to process the dung or the poo into these little balls. And then it's actually kind of cute. For many dung beetle species, they work in monogamous male-female pairs to work together to roll the dung ball to a safe place where they can bury it or place it on the surface of the soil. And that's what the female actually lays her eggs in. When those eggs hatch out, the young of the dung beetles actually use those little dung balls as food, and the whole cycle repeats itself. So not only is it an interesting ecological interaction, dung beetles working in monogamous pairs to raise a family on little poop balls, who would have thought? Nature's just too crazy. But it also helps us, but it also helps us to keep pastures healthy. Because if we didn't have the ecosystem services of things like dung beetles processing all of that poo, then the poo would pile up, parasites would come into the pasture, those parasites would harm the cattle and the other livestock, It would bring a lot of pest flies. It would just annoy all of us. And um, it would also make the forage, make the alfalfa and other forage unhealthy for the cattle to eat. So the value of this waste processing service from dung beetles alone is valued at, once again, the hundreds of millions of dollars. Insects are also critically important for pest control. I think a lot of folks who don't think too much about insects may assume that all insects are pests. Nothing could be further than the truth. There's actually a very small minority of insect species that cause us harm or that harm our agricultural crops. The vast majority of insects are actually helpful to us or cause us neither harm nor give us any benefit. But in terms of insect types that really do help us are those predators and those parasitoid insects that help to keep insect pests low and harmless from our perspective. These are known as biological control agents or natural control agents, which help to control insect pests without the use of pesticides. So here we get double the benefit. We get the natural control services that these predators, such as this wasp, this parasitoid, and this ladybird beetle larvae, give to us to keep pest populations low. But we're also able to reduce cost, both to environmental health and human health, as well as the money that would otherwise need to be spent on pesticides. And this has been valued in the billions of dollars worth of services by virtue of the fact that these predators and parasitoids eat and parasitize insect pests. That's significantly fewer dollars that we have to spend on pesticides and on associated cost cleaning up harm caused by pesticides. Finally, insects are important because they are food for many other species. You may or may not have known this, but most birds are not capable of successfully rearing their young unless they feed their young a meal that is insect protein. Nuts and berries alone, nuts and seeds alone are not enough for most birds to successfully raise their young. They need to feed them a caterpillar or a mealworm or something that's in the form of animal protein in order for birds to be able to persist. And not only are they important food for birds, but a lot of the small game and migratory birds that hunters favor, the sport and commercial fishing industry is integrally tied to insects because the fish eat them as prey. And then, of course, bird watchers and the birds that they are watching are integrally tied to insects as well. This one really just blew my mind that when we consider the value of insects as food for other wildlife, it has been estimated to be worth over $63 billion. Not a small penny. So when I talk to you about the Agroecology app, and I'm hoping to encourage you to start thinking of agroecology as being synonymous with biodiversity and to start thinking about biodiversity as being synonymous with insects. There is a little bit of a concern with some of the patterns that we've been seeing with insect populations over time. E.O. Wilson, one of the most famous entomologists that there ever was, once wrote an essay where he said, "The truth is that we need invertebrates, but they don't need us." If human beings were to disappear tomorrow, the world would go on with little change. And then the essay goes on to say, but if insects were to disappear, the world would be a disaster. So when we started seeing in about 2017, 2018, stories about the insect apocalypse, it was great cause for concern. The insect apocalypse is here. Insect Armageddon. Plummeting insect numbers threaten the collapse of nature. study confirms the severe decline of insect populations. So story after story after story about the decline of insect species. And even though scientists are still trying to understand what is causing that great collapse in insect numbers, conventional agricultural systems that rely on single species cropping systems and rely on excessive inputs of fertilizers and pesticides are a key potential culprit in those insect declines. Agroecological systems, which have the capacity to design and build a more biodiverse system, offer an alternative. When we talk about the decline in insect numbers, I want to equate that to a second pin that you can find on the Agroecology app, which is this little plane that you see flying right here. There's this hypothesis in ecology that suggests that species in an ecosystem are like rivets on a plane. Each one plays a small but critical role in plane function, such that ecosystems can tolerate the loss of a few species, the same way that a plane can likely tolerate the loss of a few rivets. But at some point, if you lose one too many species, that ecosystem will be irrevocably changed and damaged, much the same way that if you pop out one too many rivet, that plane is no longer going to be able to function as intended. The good news is that even small spaces can be diverse or can be planned to be diverse, and really garden systems, community garden systems, urban and suburban farms, agroecological systems, the whole premise of them is to build diversity into the system, a diversity of crop types, a diversity of plant types, which in and of themselves will bring other types of diversity in. If you do happen to garden, you may have, let's say, a typical garden that is just a couple hundred square feet in size. On this map right here, we have a map of Chicago on the right-hand side of the slide. Every individual point on that map is a garden space, either a private garden space or community garden space. Researchers counted 4,493 very small gardens across the entirety of the city of Chicago. Individually very small, but collectively added up to 51 acres, so quite a large space. And agroecological systems in urban areas oftentimes represent the majority of the green space in an urban and suburban landscape. One of the things I love so much about agroecology is that you can embed greenness, you can embed plant communities in almost any space you can think of, whether it's a rooftop. In some cases, people are even planting on the facades of buildings, street plantings, almost anywhere that you can envision where a plant can go, you can start to think about installing your own agroecological system. Here are just a couple of shots of different community garden spaces, our small private garden spaces. On the top left is a community garden that's in Portland, Oregon. You can see that it's in quite an urban location with all of those high-rise buildings on the south waterfront in the background. On the top right is a community garden in Spokane, Washington. I really love this particular garden space in this photo because what these gardeners have done is they're growing tomatoes and squashes on a trellis. During the day when it's sunny and warm in Spokane, Washington, they tie them up to the trellis. And at night, because the temperature drops so low and oftentimes to freezing, they take these little strings down, they tuck the plants in for the evening, surrounded by the safety of this plastic so that they don't freeze. I just love the idea of the gardeners going there every night to like tuck their plants in bed on a cold night. On the bottom left is a private garden residence in Salem, Oregon. This person just grew abundant harvest of everything you can imagine in an incredibly small garden space by using techniques such as utilizing red plastic to warm the beds early in the season so that he could raise heat-loving crops such as tomatoes. And here is an example of a community garden that was actually installed in a corporate space. I believe this is either Intel or Tektronix in Beaverton, where they recognized that the garden space was a valued asset for their employees and wanted to provide an agroecological space at work. So I want to leave you with one final call to action. Um, Choose agroecology because it's awesome and fun. But if you do choose agroecology, I do want you to know that you can affect the ecosystems around you by just being a gardener, by the plants that you choose to install. If you make particular plant choices, you will bring in more biodiversity with those choices. I love to call out this particular study. Once again, this one done in Chicago, where David Lowenstein and his colleagues were studying where they found the most bees across Chicago and where they found the most species of bee. And what they found was that in the most densely populated neighborhoods of Chicago, they had higher bee abundance, higher bee species richness, and they had more pollination services, which to me was just mind-blowing because human beings are typically associated with the demise of ecosystem services. Here was an instance where we were having a positive impact. And the mechanism was through agroecological and garden systems, where you have more people, you have more gardens, more people growing plants for food, for fun, for flowers. And where you have more flowers, you have more bees. And where you have more bees, you have the ecosystem service of pollination. Seen that same thing in my own studies of Portland area agroecological systems. Here is a map on the left-hand side of 22 gardens that we sampled for bee biodiversity. On the right-hand side is a satellite view of one of the sites. I want to point out that this site was one of our smallest sites. It was our second smallest site that we sampled for bees, just a few blocks from the I-5 corridor in a very urban area of Portland. However, this particular gardener made selections, plant selections, based upon whether or not it would bring in more biodiversity into his space. He would only plant plants that were known to have a positive impact on bees, birds, and butterflies. Out of all of the gardens that we studied, he had the second most number of bee species. 27 species in a 0.1 acre lot is just incredible. And even more, I have to note that those sites that were number one in bee species richness were 40 times larger and 100 times larger than this small urban lot, and they only had 28 bee species. So he had almost as many bee species in this tiny garden as sites that were significantly larger. It's just a true testament that if you do plant it, they will come. That's one of the reasons that I love agroecology, because it does offer opportunities to plant a diversity of different plant types, which in and of itself will help to bring in a diversity of insects, birds, and other types of biodiversity. I think that's all I have for you today.
Every time I hear you talk, I learn more and I absolutely love it. So I have just really appreciated working with you.
Thanks, Emily. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about insects any day.
My favorite, apart from butterflies, because they're pretty, I like spiders. I really like spiders.
Yeah, spiders are the coolest. I could go on a whole riff about spiders, but that'll be for another day.
So for those of you who just watched, if you have questions, unfortunately, we weren't able to ask live, but please send them to diveforag@oregonstate.edu, and Dr. Moore and I will work with Dr. Langolato here and make sure we have all of your questions answered, because we want you to be successful as you create your little mini apps, and teach us a little bit about how your life intersects with agroecology. So thanks so much for joining us, Dr. Langolato, again. And for all of our teams, good luck.